Hi guys, my name is Kunal Brambhat, and today we'll do a webinar on SAML. SAML, the Security Assertion Markup Language, also termed as SSO, the single sign-on, is an open standard for exchanging authentication and the authorization data between parties. Main components are the identity provider and a service provider. I have Amit, the subject matter expert on this, will help us understand this.
Hello, everyone. Kunal, actually talking about the two main components of SAML. There is service provider and identity provider. A service provider is any system, maybe a computer or a server within the system that provides the services. Typically, the services for which the user needs to be authenticated, including any kind of web or enterprise application. And then the second part is the identity provider. An identity provider is an entity within the system that makes sure the user really is who they claim to be. It actually authenticates the users against the credential they provided and provides the authentication information.
Okay, so SML does, by transferring the user's identity from one place, that is identity provider, to another, that is service provider, through exchange of digitally signed XML documents.
Yeah, so Kunal, when a service provider requests the authentication information about specific user from their end user's identity provider, upon successful authentication, the identity provider builds the authentication response in the form of an XML document, signs it with the digital certificate, and sends it back to the service provider.
Okay, Amit, let's understand this through a diagram.
Yeah, sure, Kunal. As you can see in the diagram, the SaaS-based application has its own authentication mechanism, which authenticates the users against the credentials saved in the database, right? Um, the application also allows the SML authentication and acts as a service provider, which authenticates the user against Microsoft Azure Active Directory. Here, ADFS acts as an identity provider. As you can see here, the organization has on-premises Active Directory setup, which is linked to ADFS Cloud and allows their users the access to the resources outside of their organization's network.
Okay, so there are certain benefits of single sign-on. So let's see them one by one. So it allows organizations to use identity of users from their Active Directory domain or intranet to log users into other web applications. So same username and password for all of the applications. That is great, right? So it reduces the complaints about the password problems. It also minimizes the phishing, thus improving the security as well. It streamlines the local, the desktop and the remote application workflows. And by doing so, it improves users' productivity as well. So let's say there are some top providers of it. Amit, can you help us with that?
Yeah, so currently there are many providers, identity providers available in the market, and we have actually listed a few most widely used amongst those providers. So one of them is like Microsoft Active, Azure Active Directory. Then we have Okta Identity Management, Identity, Ping Identity, OneLogin, and Shibboleth.
Yeah.
Um,
So let's see
yeah.
how SSO can actually help you out. I mean, SML can be very helpful in case many of your users in the organization is dealing with many of the applications on the regular basis. So SML allows to integrate local apps, web apps, and the SaaS based apps too. So it is very useful when your multiple users are interacting with so many of the application on daily basis, right? Let's try to understand this by taking a use case over here. So let's take this as a challenge that users have to enter different usernames and passwords for two different applications to gain access to the certain resources. So here's the proposed solution that we eliminate the different login systems that are present. So users should be able to log in into crmalansec.com, which is a company's internal CRM system, and then we sign in into spa.alansec.com, which is a SharePoint setup for the users, and it should be done automatically without re-entering their authentication credentials again. So how it is done? So here SAML comes into the picture. So with SSL login, a central authentication server needs to access. So in our case, let's take Azure AD as an example for central authentication server. So this is how the process flow will look in particular scenario. So let's, for example, the user accesses crmalansec.com, and then once they try to log in, the user is redirected to Azure ID, where an authentication related cookie is generated. Then let's assume that user navigates to sp.alansec.com. So in order to authenticate, user will be redirected to Azure AD. Now, at this time, the central authentication server, that is Azure AD, will check whether the user has already an authentication related cookie, uh, and if it is there, it redirects user back to the SharePoint spa.alansec.com, providing access to its features and content. So here we eliminate the need of having multiple username and passwords and entering it again and again to access multiple applications over here. So let's see how there are certain easy steps to do the SML integration. Um, Amit will help us with that.
Yeah, sure, Kunal. So actually, there are few easy steps which you can use to integrate any of the service provider into a SaaS-based application or any other application. So here we are taking the example of Azure AD. So the first of it, you log in to Azure portal as a global administrator, and then go to Azure Active Directory. Now, once you go to Active Directory, you can select the enterprise application, because actually we need to set up the application who is going to actually be the service provider, so that our identity provider knows like where to redirect the user after the successful authentication and all that. So once you select the enterprise applications, as you see, there are certain applications which are already provided by Azure AD, like Box and all others. But here we want to create our own application. So you select a non-gallery application, and then you can create a new application there. So you provide the name of your application, and then add the application. Now you can see the newly created application, right? So in that application, you can select the single sign-on option. Once you select the single sign-on option, you can select the single sign-on mode as a SML-based single sign-on, and then you can provide certain information, the identity of the actual service provider, and the reply URL, which is actually upon successful login, or in case of failure, where the identity provider will respond to. So once you add those, there is another step where you can add the attributes for the user. So let's say, for example, once the user is authenticated successfully, I want some information related to that user, maybe their first name, last name, username, and any other information. So you can specify all these attributes. So what happens when the identity provider creates a XML document upon successful login, they will add all this information into the XML response, which after that can be used by the service provider. So once you are done with configuring all the required attributes which were needed by the service provider, then you can save that, and once it is saved, you can go to the configure. So once you click on configure, you can see we have a SAML XML metadata, which is the XML file which contains all the metadata, and which you can download from Azure, and then you can use it on your service provider to authenticate the users against this Azure. Similarly, you can configure any other identity provider, let's say for Okta or some other, and then you provide all this information, download the XML metadata file, and add that metadata file to your service provider, and that's it.
So they were the simple steps to integrate the SML. But when we do the SML integration, there are certain things that we should know about it. So when we uh, when we are doing the SML integration, so basically the sites that are integrated with SML, they will be giving away their user data to a third-party provider for authentication. So in that case, if SML provide goes down, a site user will be unable to authenticate and in turn unable to use any of the application which are integrated with SML. And SML provider is a kind of hot target for hackers. So if it is hacked or breached, data loss may occur. But those are the very low risk because SML providers, identity providers do take the necessary precautions. So let's conclude this webinar for the SML. So I would say that benefits of using SML login to manage a large ecosystem of application and services are numerous compared to its disadvantages. So with an efficient SML login in place, it's easier to add more applications to the existing suite of the services without having to worry about the authentication every time. So guys, this is it. This is all about the webinar on SML. Uh, Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.